Take a person, take a story, take you on a journey. It's your take.
On today's Your Take, I talked to a human rights campaigner who was born in Melbourne, Australia in 1952. My guest moved to London in 1971, and during his time in the UK, has represented the Labour Party in the 1983 by-election. He was a leading member of the Gay Liberation Front, and with others organised Britain's first gay pride in 1972. In the 1990s, he campaigned for LGBT rights through the direct action group Outrage. He campaigned and opposed the war in Iraq in 2003, confronted Zimbabwe dictator Robert Mugabe on his human rights abuses. He's also the focus of a new documentary on his life and work, and currently streaming on Netflix. Today, I talked to Peter Tatchell. We discuss his upbringing and childhood in Australia, moving to the UK, his relentless work to bring about social change, and forming with friends the Peter Tatchell Foundation in 2011. We begin with a very warm welcome. Thank you kindly, Peter, for joining us on Your Take.
My pleasure.
Very nice to see you. I'm very much interested to talk about all the dedication, your passion and your commitment to bring about social justice and political change, not just in the UK, but what you've done globally over many years. But to be honest, I wanted to go back right to the very beginning, turning the clock back to the early 1950s, but also to another country, because you were born on January the 25th in 1952 in Melbourne, Australia. I wanted to begin by asking, who were your parents? Were you close to them? And just paint us a portrait of what they kind of did for a living.
Well, I was born into a very traditional working class family in the West Melbourne industrial area. My father was a lathe operator in an engineering factory. My mother was mostly a housewife, but sometimes worked in a local biscuit factory. They were very devout evangelical Christians, very strict, straight-laced, quite anti-intellectual, not engaged in politics at all, not interested in social issues. For them, everything revolved around the family and the church. So quite how I ended up the way I have is a bit of a mystery.
I was going to say, from an early age, you were just 4 when your parents separated and eventually divorced. I know you were very young at that time, but what are your kind of recollections of your parents breaking up? And can you tell us about your mother remarrying, because that occurred not long after the divorce? And who did your mother marry? And were you close to that person at all, or not?
Well, I sort of hardly knew my father because he often worked night shifts at the factory. So he'd, go to work in the evening, come back in the morning and then sleep. So I didn't see much of him at all. He always said he did this because he wanted to make sure that we had the best possible chances in life, that we had a comfortable life. But it meant that he was quite distant. When my parents divorced, to me, I didn't really understand it. We went back to live up with my mother's parents for a while before she remarried. And my stepfather, he was, when my mother married him, a gardener. He mowed lawns and did gardens at people's houses around the suburbs. Then later he went to work in a factory as a cleaner. Then later on was a taxi driver. He had quite a few different jobs. But again, he worked very long hours. to make ends meet and to give us a reasonable life. I mean, we were not well off at all, partly because my mother suffered from chronic life-threatening asthma. So a lot of our family income went on medical bills and medication, hospital spells as well. So life was pretty tough for us.
Did you still keep in touch with your father, or did you regard your mother remarrying? Did you regard him as kind of your father figure? How did that kind of work?
Because my parents had quite an acrimonious divorce,
Hmm.
I didn't really keep in touch with my father at all. I never accepted my stepfather as my father. I knew he wasn't. And he was also very brutal. He was a very harsh authoritarian, also a very fundamentalist Christian who believed that the man was head of the house and that the wife and children must obey him. He forced me to work from about the age of 8 or 9, doing chores, not only around the house, but we squatted a cow on land nearby. It was my job to look after the cow, to take it water in the morning and evening, and also to move it from paddock to paddock to get fresh grass. Plus, I had to look after a coop of about 20 chickens. I had to help with making butter and selling it to neighbours. So it was quite an industrious childhood.
I wanted to move on to your schooling and find out where you went to school, and were they happy years in your life? Were you able to kind of escape the reality of family life during your kind of academic years?
To some extent. I'd say that school, pardon me, was an escape. It was an escape from the tyranny of my stepfather and the rather suffocating family life that I had. I did very well at school, both academically and sporting wise. I was a very popular pupil. In the last year at school in 1968, when I was 16, I was voted head boy by a ballot of all the male pupils. And that's sort of quite surprising because I was very left-wing even then. Many people suspected I was gay, but they liked the fact that I stood up for pupil power. I challenged the school authorities and demanded representation for students and challenged things that were not right about the way the school was organized. So that won me a lot of plaudits and also achieved some very positive changes.
Interestingly, I wanted to come back to 1968, where you mentioned you were the head boy at your school. You left school, though, at the age of 16, and I believe that was partly down to your family being strained by economic reasons, financial reasons, and medical bills. But you went on to work as a sign writer and a window dresser. I wanted to ask how you look back at that period of your life and what life experiences were gained from kind of leaving school at such a young age and going straight out to the workplace and working in kind of different areas and different aspects of life.
Well, actually, I grew up very quickly, very young. Not only was my stepfather basically using me as hired unpaid labor, but also because my mother she nearly died 8 times during my childhood. So it fell to me to look after my younger half brother and half sisters. So I would, when they were babies, I would change their nappies, make their bottle milk and feed them. When they got a bit older, I would dress them for school, make them school lunches and so on. So I was, even from the age of 8, I was doing that. I was taking responsibility as a child stroke adult, filling in when mum couldn't and when my stepfather was absent working. So I did grow up very quickly, but my passion was art and design. I'd wanted to go into that field, but because of financial pressures my family needed me to go out to work to help supplement the family income. I couldn't go to art college or university. No, they couldn't have afforded it anyway. So I hit on the idea of going to work in the design department, display and design department of a big department store, which is what I did. And I entered that job as a junior assistant, and very quickly learned the ropes. And in fact, within 18 months, I was promoted to a senior position, both making and designing windows, interiors, logos, and sign writing.
You mentioned at the beginning of the interview, interestingly, about that your parents raised you as a Christian, and they were kind of very heavily, actively involved in the church. When and why did you turn your back on your faith and become an open atheist?
Well, I'd never heard of Epicurus, but I asked very similar questions.
Yeah.
If God is so powerful, why does he allow millions of people to die from hunger or from earthquakes or famines? This didn't seem right. It didn't seem a just, fair God. And of course, carefully reading the Bible, I could see it was filled with so many contradictions and some pretty ghastly things. That it's justified to sell your daughter into slavery in certain circumstances. That you're not allowed to, if you're a man, you're not allowed to shave the corners of your beard or cut the corners of your beard. Eating shellfish was against God's law. All these things struck me as either irrational and without any evidential foundation, and indeed just plain wrong. I was, however, quite enamored by the New Testament and Christ's gospel of love and compassion. To me, the Sermon on the Mount, the parable of the Good Samaritan, these were all things that I related to. And what gave them a sort of social conscience or connection was when I was 11 years old, I heard about the bombing of a black church in Birmingham, Alabama, in the United States, where 4 young girls about my own age were murdered by white racists. So I was profoundly shocked by that. I was only 11 years old, but I could see straight away that was just so wrong. And I thought to myself, maybe if I was black and I'd been there, I could have been killed, or my brother or sister. So that prompted my interest in and support for the Black Civil Rights Movement, which of course was led by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And he, for me, made Christianity something live, relevant, engaging. For my parents, Christianity was all about, the do's and don'ts of personal life. Don't have sex now before marriage. Women shouldn't wear lipstick. Dancing was sinful. All those kind of things from a quite extreme sect of Christianity. Whereas Martin Luther King was talking about, justice, love, compassion. And I related to that much more than my parents' own Christianity. So all these factors sort of came together from about the age of 13 or 14, to cast doubt in my mind about religion per se. And I gradually, over a number of years, gravitated towards what I saw as a more rational, scientific understanding of the world, rather than a superstitious and irrational one.
Interesting point to talk about your political awareness and you wanting to bring about social change. And I wanted to kind of go back to the kind of roots of that, because you became fairly politically active during your time at Mount Waverley Secondary College. And I kind of wanted to ask, what drew you to becoming politically aware, politically motivated, and becoming a human rights campaigner?
Well, I suppose, as I said, it all began with that bombing of the black church and my subsequent interest in the Black Civil Rights Movement. And, for me, they were putting Christianity and Christian values into practice. And of course, I translated that to my own situation in Australia, looking at the horrendous ill treatment of the indigenous Black Australians, the Aboriginal people, who had been dispossessed of their land by British colonization in the 18th century, had actually been hunted down by settlers and killed off by European introduced diseases. So I very quickly began to be involved in campaigns for Indigenous Aboriginal rights. I also, because I had an inquiring mind, at the time Australia was fighting alongside the Americans in Vietnam, we were told this is a great just war against communism, that if we didn't defeat the communists in Vietnam, they would come and invade Australia. And I always thought that's a bit of a stretch over thousands and thousands of miles. As far as I knew, the Vietnamese didn't have much of a navy. But I began to read history books, and I soon learned that, you know, what we were being told by the Australian government and by the American government was a pack of lies. Mm-hmm. So that got me involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement and in the Allied movement against the draft for Vietnam.
I wanted to talk about some of the campaigns you're involved in, some of which you've spoken about already during your time at college, because as you've already mentioned, you were involved in setting up a scholarship scheme for Aboriginal people, and you led a campaign to protect their land rights. You spoke about campaigning against America's involvement and Australia in the Vietnam War. You also campaigned against the hanging of Ronald Ryan in 1967. But when you look back at your involvement in these issues in the late 1960s, how do you think you were perceived at the time by your peers and your teachers?
I think there were mixed emotions. Some people thought I was, brave and principled. Others thought I was a bit extreme and beyond the pale, because a lot of these issues that I was championing when I was still at school were very outside the mainstream. They were not respectable issues and campaigns to be involved with. So, I remember, in the early days, there was overwhelming Australian public support for the war in Vietnam and for conscription for that war. Likewise, there was a complete apathy, ignorance, and even indifference to the plight of Indigenous Black Australians. On the issue of the hanging of Ronald Ryan, a lot of people thought he should be hanged. He allegedly shot dead a prison warder during a jail escape in Melbourne. But I was only 15 years old when I realized, having read the autopsy report on the dead warder's body, that from where Ronald Ryan was standing when he allegedly fired the fatal shot, and where the warder was standing when he was struck down by that fatal shot, the bullet would have had to do a semi-U-turn in midair. So I, contrary to the popular belief and the consensus at the time, felt that there was at least a serious doubt about whether Ronald Ryan was guilty, let alone that he should hang.
You've given us a portrait of your childhood growing up in Melbourne, Australia, your years at college and so forth. But I kind of wanted to move on to move into London in the early 1970s, to be exact, 1971. What made you leave Australia? And what was London like in the early 70s? And what would you say were the cultural differences that you experienced?
Well, of course, when I left Melbourne, Australia, in the state of Victoria, it was a very illiberal place. There was widespread censorship of books, plays, and films. Abortion and homosexuality were totally illegal. A divorce was difficult and very much regarded as shameful. It was not a nice place to be. It was quite authoritarian and repressive. In terms of LGBT plus rights, male homosexuality was a serious criminal offense. You could be jailed for several years and even forced to undergo compulsory psychiatric treatment in a mental hospital. That's how bad it was. So I've got to say that I always wanted to travel, because from an early age, I had a great interest in different cultures and histories. You know, I want to listen and learn about other peoples and their experiences, their culture and their history. So travel abroad was always on my mind from a very early age. But I also want to escape the very authoritarian culture as well. I want to go somewhere more liberal and progressive and open-minded. But the real final impulse was the fact that with the draft for Vietnam, I was not prepared to collaborate or cooperate with the draft in any way. So I wasn't even prepared to register for national service. And if I'd stayed in Australia and maintained that position, I would have been sent to prison for 2 years. Now, in some respects, I feel I wish I'd stayed and gone to prison to make a stand. But I'd just begun my first serious relationship. And the idea of being apart from my partner for 2 years was just a bit too much for me to bear with at the tender age of 19.
You've been very open about your sexuality since the late 1960s, but I wanted to ask how your parents reacted. And can you talk about becoming a member of the Gay Liberation Front whilst you were living in London in those kind of early years in the 1970s?
Well, for my parents, homosexuality was one of the worst possible sins, around about equivalent to rape and murder. It was disgusting, vile, shameful, and a terrible, terrible sin for which you would pay an appalling price at the hands of God. So for me to be gay was a really, really big thing. My own perception was, when I went to work in the department store at the age of 17, for the first time I met other gay people, gay guys about my own age, intelligent, compassionate, good-looking, friendly, open-hearted. It completely changed my view about homosexuality. And I thought to myself, well, the Bible says one thing, but I've met these people. They're not monsters. You know, they're not child molesters or rapists. You know, they're just people like me. So that opened my mind eventually to the possibility that I might be gay. Up until that point, I'd assumed and perceived myself to be straight. You know, I sort of dated girls, obviously not had sex because that was forbidden by Christian churches. But I envisaged myself marrying and having a family with a woman, not a man. So eventually, I had one of the colleagues at work who obviously liked me and used to flatter me a bit and often invited me home for dinner, and I knew what that meant. So I always used to say no. We used to have a giggle about it. Then probably 3 or 4 months later, suddenly out of the blue, he asked me and I said, okay. He almost fell off his chair. Well, he did fall off his chair. And I can remember going back to his small bedsit, which was on the beach near St Kilda, just south of the city of Melbourne. A beautiful romantic dinner, looking out over Port Phillip Bay with the dolphins or porpoises bobbing in and out of the water. You couldn't ask for anything more romantic. And then we had sex, and for me it was just an experiment. I thought, well, I'll try it and see. You know, if I don't like it, I won't do it again. But I absolutely loved it. I remember thinking after having sex, lying back on the bed, well, if this is what gay is, I am definitely gay and I love it. And we ended up having a relationship for nearly 3 years, and we are still to this day lifelong best friends.
I wanted to ask you kind of 2 questions. When your parents found out about your sexuality, was there a complete disconnect, and did you kind of break away from them as a result of you announcing or them hearing about your sexuality? And then kind of my second question, I wanted to talk about your time living in London. And I wanted to ask about your experiences working and living as a gay male in a big cosmopolitan city. Obviously, London at the time during the 1970s and 1980s. And when you kind of look back in retrospect, how do you think perceptions and moods have changed culturally, socially, and politically, when you look back kind of 40 years to kind of the current time today?
Well, of course, I did not initially dare tell my parents. I thought they would quite possibly dob me into the police, or at the very least, get my partner arrested and jailed. So that was just too dangerous to do in a situation where homosexuality was totally illegal and punishable by imprisonment. But what I did do is begin to drop hints, like drips on a stone, gradually wearing away the stone. So, I might, if there's a news item about a gay person, I'd say, oh, whatever you think about gay people, they shouldn't be persecuted, they shouldn't be put in prison, that's wrong, live and let live. Or if there was a report about gay rights protests in America, I'd say, oh, good on them, they deserve equal rights. They shouldn't suffer discrimination. And at work, I mentioned that there were other gay people, or there were gay people, not other gay people, there were gay people, and they seemed fine. I said, why are people so angry, and so hateful towards them? So over a period of time, gradually my parents sort of joined the dots and then realized I was gay, and they asked me. And of course I said, yes, I am. And there were tears for a while, but eventually they sort of came around. It's been quite a tough journey, but eventually they came around, and broadly they've been supportive of my LGBT plus and other human rights work. Although my mother, who's still alive today, aged 94, wow, she still thinks that homosexuality is wrong because it says so in the Old Testament, but she doesn't think it's a major sin anymore. It's not like murder or robbing people or racism or things like that. She puts it in perspective, and she now also believes that homophobia is wrong, that's a terrible sin. So there's been a journey, and my parents always said to me, dropping the hints slowly and gently was the kind way to do it. It enabled them to have the time and space to adjust to the idea that I might be gay, and so that when I did confirm it, it wasn't such a huge shock.
And your time in London in the 1970s, and if we go back to the 1980s as well, did you find it was a fairly liberal place overall, or did you feel there was a lot of hostility even back then? We obviously, historically, we hear stories going back 40, 50 years ago, and attitudes have changed incredibly. But I just wanted to kind of ask, when you look back in retrospect, what were times like back in London, in the UK around that time, and how have perceptions changed in current time today?
Well, of course, coming to London in 1971 was a great liberation. By comparison to Melbourne, London was much more liberal. It wasn't perfect by a long shot, but much more liberal by comparison. And of course, I joined the newly formed Gay Liberation Front. Back in Melbourne, there were no LGBT plus organizations, let alone campaign groups, but there wasn't even any helplines or switchboards back in Melbourne. There was nothing. So to come to London and meet and campaign with other openly LGBT plus people, to be able to go to gay bars and the small clubs that existed back then, that was a great personal liberation. It was, exciting. It was much better than what I'd been used to. And of course here, attitudes such as censorship and abortion, homosexuality and so on, attitudes on these issues were much more liberal and progressive than back in Australia. But it wasn't perfect. The 1967 law reform was only very partial and limited. In fact, most aspects of gay male life remained criminalised in England and Wales right up until 2003. So the idea that 1967 was, the end of persecution is a nonsense. In fact, police harassment and arrests increased by 400% in the 7 years after 1967. So, London was better, but not best. And in fact, through the Gay Liberation Front, we began the process of challenging a lot of the injustices that LGBT plus people faced. With the birth of the Gay Liberation Front, for the first time in Britain, literally thousands of LGBT plus people came out. That had never happened before. Thousands protested in the streets. That had never happened before. We began to take on the church, the police, the government, the judiciary, the prison system, the media, all the different institutions that were persecuting LGBT plus people. And that had never happened before. And we were not defensive or apologetic. We demanded our rights. We were inspired by the Black Civil Rights Movement in America. We were inspired by the slogan, "Black is beautiful," which we transformed into "Gay is good." These were revolutionary ideas in societies which had for thousands of years repressed and persecuted LGBT plus people. And it's just such an honor for me to have been a small part of that momentous Gay Liberation Front era in the early 1970s.
I wanted to come on now to talk about your political involvement in joining the Labour Party in 1978, but specifically talk about the year 1983, because you stood in a by-election after MP Bob Mellish retired. The Liberal Democrat Simon Hughes won the seat. But how do you look back at your time serving in the Labour Party? And would you say you were naturally aligned to Labour's core values? And then I also wanted to ask you what made you decide to leave the Labour Party in 1999 and join the Green Party in 2004?
Well, I had, from my school days, been a left-wing firebrand. I wanted to change society. I could see injustices. My own family experienced it. We were poor and working class, made poorer by the lack of a national health service and the medical bills that my mother had to pay for her chronic life-threatening asthma. So I always remember thinking at an early age how unfair and unjust it was that we should suffer financially and now in our material life simply because our mother was sick, and because neither my father nor my stepfather had a particularly good job. That struck me as really wrong, and I thought there's got to be a better way, a fairer way to organize society. So right from that early age, I was looking to and supporting campaigns to change society, to have a system of economy where there was democracy and fairness, where people who were poor and working class were not shut out of power and shut out of society. Although we have one person, one vote in the political system, we certainly don't have that in the economic system. The managers, directors, and the major shareholders have all the votes, and the workers who work in industries like my stepfather did, or indeed in public services like the National Health Service, those workers have very little power at all. They are just subjects of the diktats of the bosses. So my instinct was always very much towards a radical social change. And initially I didn't join the Labour Party because I thought it was too right-wing. I thought the Labour Party was about the welfare state, improving social welfare benefits and public services, which is fine, but it wasn't actually about changing the fundamental balance of wealth and power. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to change the fundamental balance of wealth and power. But eventually, in the late 70s, having been never a member of revolutionary left-wing organizations, but sort of sympathetic to, I saw the flaws and the failings and the shortcomings. And I thought, well, the idea of having a rerun of the Russian Revolution in Britain is just so absurd. You know, we are a different country with a different history and culture. Plus, of course, so many revolutions end up with a lot of bloodshed and end up as tyrannies. So that's not the way to go. So I thought, well, you know, the Labour Party is the mass party of working class people. It's the main vehicle or instrument of social change via Parliament. So I'll join it and I'll do my bit to help change it. And this was in a period when the left was in the ascendancy in the Labour Party, and when there were big moves to democratise the party, to give the membership more power and influence, and also to enact new radical policies for the kind of fundamental social change that I envisaged and supported. So that's why I joined the Labour Party. And of course, I fought the 1983 Bermondsey by-election in South London as a left-wing Labour candidate, you know, and, you know, I was demonized and vilified for my policies, but so many of them were ahead of their time and are now the mainstream. You know, I argued for a national minimum wage. Even the Labour Party leadership said that was too extreme. You know, I was denounced in the press for you'll wreck British industry if we have a national minimum wage. I argued for a comprehensive anti-discrimination law to protect everyone against discrimination and to ensure equal rights. That was also deemed, even by the Labour Party, to be extremist. And I was told not to mention that at the press conferences. I argued for the withdrawal of British troops from the north of Ireland and for a negotiated political settlement. I was denounced as an IRA sympathizer. I wasn't. I was totally opposed to the IRA's violent tactics, but you know, I was denounced as an IRA sympathizer. Yet, you know, 25 years later, we had the Northern Ireland peace agreement, and everybody agrees now it's a damn good thing, and they want to preserve it. So, you know, I just think, well, I was perhaps a bit ahead of my time, but I'm glad to know that some of the ideas I espoused are now the mainstream, now consensus. You know, we've got the Equality Act, which does guarantee everyone equal rights and protection against discrimination. In terms of my transition to the Green Party, I remained within Labour despite its rightward drift under Neil Kinnock and then under Tony Blair. I had big misgivings, but I thought, well, this is the mass party of working people. It is the best chance we've got to change things. So we have to stay in it and fight for those changes. But really, for me, the last straw was when in 1999, I think it was, Gordon Brown, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, gave pensioners a derisory 75 pence pension increase. This was at a time when the national insurance budget had a surplus of £7.5 billion. I thought, to treat senior citizens with such an insulting, derisory pension increase, it just shows that Labour has lost the plot. And then what made it even worse is that Labour then sought to rig the selection process for Mayor of London in order to exclude Ken Livingstone. Now, whatever you think about Ken Livingstone, he had a right, like anybody else, to stand for selection as the Labour candidate for Mayor of London. But the Labour Party deliberately manipulated the selection process to make sure he was not selected. So I thought to myself, not only is Labour not socialist, it's not even democratic. So I left Labour in the year 2000. But I didn't join the Green Party till 4 years later. I'd been working with the Green Party as a Labour Party member for 10 or 15 years. Because I'm one of these people who's not sectarian or tribalist. I believe that all progressive forces should work together and unite. The only way we're going to defeat the Tories is if we collaborate. You know, I remember in the 1980s, I proposed, along with Bruce Kent, who was then the chair of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, we proposed the idea of an anti-Tory alliance to target seats where the Tories could be defeated, so that parties would stand down to enable the party with the best chance to have a clear run in order to oust the Tories. We got very little traction then. And even today, you know, those of us who advocate still a progressive alliance of anti-Tory parties, we're very much on the fringes. And sadly, both the Liberal Democrats and Labour are refusing to play ball. I think it is so selfish, so sectarian. They're putting their party interests above the interests of working people and women and minorities. You know, we've got to work together. The number one enemy are the Tories. They're the ones who are the roadblock to progressive social change. We've got to do everything we can in our power to get rid of them. And if that means Labour standing down for Green candidates in some seats, for Liberal Democrats standing down for Labour in other seats, and so on, so be it. The number one priority is to get rid of the Tories. And we can do it, because Boris Johnson got an 80-seat majority in 2019 based on less than 44% of the vote. That is not democracy. You know, in this country, never since 1931 has any party won a majority of the popular vote. Not Margaret Thatcher during her landslide in 1983, not Tony Blair during his landslide in 1997. No party ever since 1931 has won a majority of the popular vote. Yet they've won power and they've exercised it without a genuine mandate from a majority of the British people. It shows that the task or the projects begun by the Chartists and the suffragettes have still not been won.
It's interesting how you mentioned you'd love to see electoral change and a change into our voting system, which I agree with you, seems very outdated, this first past the post system. And like you say, you know, an election where, you know, so say a majority is about 30% of the popular vote, which, you know, it just doesn't seem democratic when you kind of weigh up the numbers. Interestingly, you spoke about leaving the Labour Party in 1999, and historically it comes on to kind of my next question. You mentioned about your disillusionment under New Labour, how the Labour Party had changed to become a more central party and very popular. You know, they won 3 straight elections, which a Labour Party hadn't done historically. Over many, many years, they'd never been re-elected. But I want to talk about very much a key divisive moment in the New Labour era was the invasion of Iraq, the Iraq war in 2003 under Blair's leadership. And we know so much, you know, 20 years on with the Iraq inquiry, all the evidence that has come out and been broadcast since. You were very much opposed to the Iraq war at the time, very much in opposition to it. When you look back now in hindsight, how do you look back? You know, are your views still very much the same? And do you think Iraq now, after the war, do you think it's in a worse place than it was before?
Well, certainly there's no doubt in my mind that the concern of Tony Blair and George W. Bush for the people of Iraq was a very recent thing. They suddenly became very interested and concerned. They suddenly saw Saddam Hussein as a great bogeyman. I can remember in the late 70s, early 1980s, going on protests in solidarity with Iraqi people struggling against Saddam Hussein. I never saw Tony Blair or Labour MPs there. Maybe I probably Jeremy Corbyn was there, I think. But basically, the Labour Party didn't really give a damn about what Saddam Hussein was doing to his own people. And so I saw the war not only as illegal and wrong, but just as incredible hypocrisy by people who had never previously cared a jot about what was happening to the people of Iraq under the monstrous, bloodthirsty dictator that Saddam Hussein was. I think all the criticisms of the war have been 100% vindicated since. What has happened is that, yes, Saddam Hussein is gone. To some degree, there is a more democratic system. To some degree, there are some more rights and freedoms, but they are very limited and very curtailed. I mean, it's not worth avoiding the fact that today in Iraq, we have rule basically by an Islamic bloc, which does not truly respect the rights of women, workers, minority nationalities, minority religions, LGBT people, and others. It is an improvement on Saddam Hussein, but it is no way is it anything approaching democracy and human rights. And of course, it was precisely in the wake of the chaos and destruction of the Iraq War that Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and other extremist groups were able to flourish. And, they're not necessarily directly related to that conflict, but the atmosphere, conditions, the chaos, the lack of focus on the real issues by Western governments and the United Nations created the conditions where these extremists could gain traction and gain support. And we've seen it in Afghanistan with the resurgence of the Taliban coming back to power. A very similar scenario there. The United Nations and other agencies really took the eye off the ball. We were told, just weeks before the Taliban took power, that it was not one of the cards, that they didn't have the support, they didn't have the capacity. But anybody who had been following what was happening in Afghanistan, and in similar senses in Iraq, knew that conditions were being created for bad things to happen. So I think everybody who protested against the war can be vindicated in that no weapons of mass destruction were found, and the chaos and ongoing conflicts and human rights abuses that have followed were exactly as people feared.
I wanted to turn the clock back now to 2011, a decade ago, when your friends formed the Peter Tatchell Foundation and you were appointed its director. What made them set up the foundation? And can you just tell us about the foundation's purpose, the people involved and the patrons you work alongside, and some of the campaigns you're most proud of supporting and being actively involved in?
Well, the existence of the Peter Tatchell Foundation came about because I'd been doing human rights work unpaid, without staff support, and without an office for decades. I did bits of research in journalism to earn about £5,000, £6,000 or £7,000 a year, and the rest was all unpaid. And I was happy to do that. But my friend said, clearly you're not as effective as you could be. If you had an office and staff support, if you didn't have to worry about money, then you could be more effective. So a group of them got together and basically issued an ultimatum. We are going to form this organization. We want to call it the Peter Tatchell Foundation. And I was initially, quite resistant, in particular resistant to the name. I thought, I don't want to use my own name. It sounds a bit egotistical. They said, well, if we call it the Human Rights Association or something, no one will know who it is. But because you've had a public profile for many years, people will recognize the Peter Tatchell Foundation. So reluctantly, I agreed. We are a very small NGO. There's just myself, my assistant, Pliny Sukamani, and a part-time communications and media person, Simon Harris. So 2.5 of us. Our remit is basically to promote and defend human rights in Britain and around the world. About half of our work is on LGBT plus rights, and about half of it is on other human rights, democracy, and civil liberties issues. Roughly 50% is focused in the UK and 50% supporting campaigners in other countries. We tend to focus on issues and campaigns that are perhaps under the radar, not well resourced. So of course we support the Freedom for Tibet, but there's lots of campaigns and campaigners working on that issue. We can't add much value. So we're focusing on Balochistan, the occupied region of Pakistan, on West Papua, annexed and occupied by Indonesia, and a few places like that where not many other campaigners are focused. And so we want to try and use our limited small resources to have the biggest impact for those people who are basically forgotten and disregarded.
Throughout the interview, you've spoken about the campaigns, all the involvement of things you've tried to bring about social change, things you've been passionate about. Of all the things you've done, is there a particular moment or campaign you've been heavily involved in that you're kind of most proud of?
That's a really hard one because there's been a lot of campaigns. I mean, the Netflix documentary, Hating Peter Tatchell, focuses on about a dozen or so campaigns, but that's a dozen out of thousands over the last 55 years. A lot of campaigns and a lot of successes. Of course, not by me alone. It's always me working in collaboration with others. Collectively, that's how we bring about the change. But just to pull out a couple, I mean, I'd say that I'm very proud of the Outrage campaign in the 1990s. Outrage was the LGBT plus direct action and civil disobedience group, modeled on the suffragettes and the Black Civil Rights Movement in America. It did amazing things to highlight discrimination, hate crime, and persecution of LGBT plus people. And one of them was challenging police homophobia, the witch hunting of the gay community by the police. We tried negotiating with the police. They gave us tea and sandwiches, but then they kept on raiding more bars and clubs and saunas, arresting more gay and bisexual men for consenting victimless behavior. So we embarked on a very high profile campaign of civil disobedience and direct action, occupying police stations, interrupting press conferences by Metropolitan Police officers, exposing undercover agents provocateurs, police who dressed up as in a gay style, with tight white jeans and black leather jacket. They'd go into public toilets or parks and play with their genitals and then arrest any man who responded. We did all that, and it had an amazing result. Within 3 months, the police were pleading with us to come back to the negotiating table, and we did. But we didn't come back empty-handed. We came back with a set of ideas for a non-homophobic policing policy, ideas we'd dreamt up ourselves, and ideas that had been already put into practice by more progressive police forces in cities like Amsterdam, Copenhagen, and Stockholm. So the police were really thrown because they just thought we were a protest group. But when we came back with these concrete, practical ideas, they didn't know what to do. They were like rabbits caught in the headlights. But that they couldn't, refuse us because we publicized to the media and to members of parliament what we were doing, and the police were being monitored every step of the way. So they were terrified. And eventually, I've got to say that within a year of going back to negotiations, the police agreed to 3/4 of our demands. I think there were about 12 of them. 3/4 of our demands for a non-homophobic policing policy. And within 3 years, the number of gay and bisexual men convicted for consenting behavior between adults fell by 2/3. That's the biggest, fastest fall ever recorded. And it literally saved thousands of gay and bisexual men of the stigma of a criminal conviction and the penalties like imprisonment or fines that went with it.
You briefly mentioned the new documentary feature film, which is called Hating Peter Tatchell, but I'd imagine it must be a great honor having a film made about you from from a biographical point of view, and also looking back at your life and all the work you've done. But my question was going to be, what are your opinions on the finished film? And how did it feel seeing your life story being portrayed on screen from the director's perspective, and obviously others' opinions, the interviewees, talking heads, and so on?
Well, it was the film of the director, Christopher Amos. It was his baby. I did collaborate a bit, but he basically had a free hand to do whatever he wanted. And he came up with the idea of calling it Hating Peter Tatchell, because in doing the research and background for the film, he was astonished, flabbergasted, appalled by the level of hatred and homophobia and vitriol directed against me. So I think the name, although it's a bit provocative, was very apt and appropriate. He did have to distill, as I said, literally thousands of campaigns down to about a dozen or so. And I think he did a very good job. For me, the most important thing about the film is I wanted to show that social change is possible and to give people tips on how to do it. I hope this film is watched by people and will inspire them to themselves become change makers. So the film, it is a great thing and a great honor to have this film made. I feel rather embarrassed by it. Who am I to deserve it? But in terms of being a sort of example or model of how to do campaigning and hopefully inspire others, I think it's been well worth it. The response has been overwhelmingly positive. It's been, I've been surprised by how many people have seen it and how many people have not been aware of many of the things I've done, and who have been inspired to begin their own campaigns. Several people have said to me, having watched your film, I'm a very keen fighter for women's rights. I'm going to set up a new campaign group around women's rights. Others have talked about, taking the template to fight for the rights of disabled people and for Black and ethnic minority people. So as an inspiration, I'm really pleased that that's the positive outcome. In terms of the content, the biggest, most surprising thing is, of course, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. George Carey. He was very critical when I, in outrage, interrupted his 1998 Easter sermon in Canterbury Cathedral to protest against his support for legal discrimination against LGBT plus people. He wasn't just saying that gay people are sinful and should repent. He was saying the law should discriminate, that MPs should not vote for gay equality. So we had to challenge him because he wouldn't meet us. He wouldn't negotiate with us. He wouldn't meet us. So we went to his cathedral, and we didn't interrupt the sacred parts of the service. We didn't abuse him or the Christian religion. We just called him out and said, he's preaching a gospel which is incompatible with Christ's gospel of love and compassion. Discrimination is not a Christian value. At the time, he described me as a bullying kind of character. But in the interviews that are included in the Netflix film, he says that he's had a change of heart, that in hindsight, he thinks I'm doing what Jesus would have done. To which my response was, well, I hope I don't suffer the fate of Jesus, which was a rather ugly and grisly one. But I thought that was a very generous thing to say. He said that I would, in his view, be ultimately judged as being on the right side of history, and that he accepts that I am motivated by a genuine, sincere commitment to the principle of universal human rights. And of course, he knows very well that I do defend Christians who are persecuted in Pakistan or Saudi Arabia as much as I defend LGBT plus people.
I've got one final question before we move on to what I call the final quick fire questions that we ask or your take guess. So my final question, Peter Tatchell, is you've lived in Britain since the late 1970s, and we spoke about
Early 1970s.
The early 1970s, and we spoke about your time moving to the capital and some of the campaigns and what you were involved in at that time. I wanted to ask you, you've obviously seen major social, political, cultural and technological changes in your lifetime. What changes have you embraced? What changes have you opposed? And based on your political beliefs, which government have best served your values during your time in the UK?
That's an awful lot of questions in one.
It is an awful lot of questions in one.
Well, just to give people a flavour, when I arrived in London in 1971, a postage stamp cost 2.5 pence. A pint of milk cost 5 pence. A loaf of bread, 8 or 10 pence at the most. You could ride 2 or 3 stops on the tube for 5 pence. That gives you a flavour about how things have moved on. And of course, there was no internet, no mobile phones, no photocopiers, nothing like that. If you want to organise a protest, you have to go to a phone box, put coins into a little tray, and then phone around friends. It was a very, very different, a much more difficult era for protest, but we still managed. In terms of the changes that I've helped to bring about, well, there's many, but I emphasize I've helped to bring them about. It's been together with many others. So, I was for many years involved in the anti-apartheid movement. And of course, apartheid is now history, largely due to the efforts of people inside South Africa, led by the African National Congress, but also, as Nelson Mandela said, with the support, the valued support, the effective support of campaigners around the world who boycotted, sanctioned, and disinvested from South Africa as apartheid regime. The poll tax is history. Remember Margaret Thatcher's flagship policy? She said was not negotiable. It was a policy whereby instead of paying local rates, people would pay a poll tax. And it was the same whether you were poor and impoverished or a multimillionaire. And people just saw that as so wrong. And they rebelled, and many, apart from the hundreds of thousands of people who protested in the streets, hundreds of thousands more like me either refused to pay the poll tax or delayed payments to make the system unworkable. So Margaret Thatcher had to abandon the poll tax against all her wishes. On LGBT plus rights, we've gone from 1999, when by volume Britain had the largest number of anti-LGBT laws in the world, some of them dating back centuries, to just 14 years later, in 2013, with the advent of same-sex marriage, to being one of the best countries in the world. So that's got to be, I think, the fastest, most successful law reform campaign in British history. So there's just a few examples, a few of many things that I've witnessed in my lifetime, and they've all come about because people have said, we've had enough. We're not going to put up with things the way they are. We want change. We're going to join with other people. We're going to protest. We're going to campaign. We're going to secure change. And indeed, they, we, us did.
And my kind of final question that was kind of wrapped in with all those was, when you look back at your time in the UK living here, which government do you feel has best served kind of your values, since you moved here in the early 1970s?
None, really.
No.
I suppose Tony Blair's government was better than any of the others, although it fell short, way short of what I aspired to. But Tony Blair did bring in Sure Start scheme for young kids. He did introduce the national minimum wage. He did secure the peace deal in Northern Ireland. He did devolve government to Wales and Scotland. So those were progressive things. And if it hadn't been for the Iraq War, he probably would have done a lot more progressive things, but that really derailed him and his government. And unfortunately, He didn't introduce proportional representation, even though he commissioned Lord Jenkins to do a report which advised in favour of it. And if he had, of course, we wouldn't have had the Conservative governments since David Cameron in 2010, because the Conservatives never won a majority of the popular vote. And that would have been, it would have been impossible under PR for them to form a government. Now, I would remind you that in 2010, David Cameron won the support of only 24% of eligible voters, yet he formed a government with a majority. It's just so outrageous, so outrageous.
We move on now, Peter Tatchell, to the questions we ask all our guests on Your Take. They're kind of things you like, people that have inspired you. They're kind of just quick fire questions just to kind of finish the interview. Number one, what would you say is your favorite pastime?
I thought you were going to ask me my favorite color. My favorite pastime is trekking and hiking in mountains.
We move on to cinema. What would you say is your favorite film and why?
That's a really hard call, really tough one. I always have a great soft spot for Second Serve, starring the wonderful, extraordinary person whose name I can't remember, Vanessa Redgrave. It's the story of Renee Richards, the trans tennis player in the 1980s. It's an incredibly moving story, and Vanessa Redgrave played both Renee Richards as a man and a woman with absolutely total conviction and credibility.
From the cinema now to novels, who would you say is your favorite novelist?
I don't really have a favorite novelist, but I guess I do like Armistead Maupin's Tales from the City. And that's a great series. And, for a lot of LGBT plus people, when they first came out, it really was a lifeline, a sort of a novel where we could see ourselves, we could relate to the tales of the city.
I'm interested to hear your answer to the next one, because you've been so passionate about what you've done over the last 40 to 50 years. So this could be interesting. If you could have had a different profession, what would it have been?
Oh, definitely an artist and designer.
You mentioned creativity when we spoke about your early schooling years. Who in life, though, would you say has been your greatest inspiration?
I wouldn't say one person, but I would say Mohandas Gandhi, Sylvia Pankhurst, Martin Luther King, and to some extent, Malcolm X and Rosa Luxemburg.
Do you read a newspaper? And if so, which one?
Mostly The Guardian, but also look at the BBC website as well.
What would you say is your favourite food?
Probably, I like new modern British cuisine, but also like Chinese a lot as well.
You've already mentioned maybe some of these people when you cited your inspirations in life, but we move on to a favourite cultural icon. Who would you choose?
Cultural icon. Well, I suppose Oscar Wilde, not only for his life story, but also for his plays and his very dignified defense of being gay before the court. He was also, of course, a radical socialist. He believed in a fundamental change in society. So on both or all those counts, I think it's Oscar Wilde.
What would you say is your favorite curse word and why?
My favorite word, Schweppes. I try not to swear. I do swear a bit, I've got to say, when I get mostly over petty, silly things, and when I'm tired and run down, But yeah, Scraps is probably my favorite
What would
and
you say,
most commonly used.
what would you say is your favorite place or holiday destination?
Um, no doubt about Venezuela. I went there in 2002 and trekked all through the Gran Sabana, um, in the islands off the coast. But the best bit of all was trekking to the Angel Falls, the world's highest waterfall, almost 1 kilometer from top to bottom. And I actually trekked right under the falls. At the top, it was a gigantic gushing cauldron of water. By the time it had fallen almost 1 kilometer, it was more like heavy rain.
We move on to music now. Who would you say is your favorite music artist and your favorite album of all time?
Again, it's really hard to say a favorite. I mean, I love trance dance music, electronic dance music. So people like Calvin Harris, and many others. But I also like Tiny Temper. I think his song Invincible is one of the great love anthems. You know, a modern Shakespeare to rap. Beyond that, I like Taylor Swift, you know, Lana Del Rey, lots and lots of people. It's impossible to say one because I've got very generic and wide musical tastes.
Could you pick a favorite album that you maybe go back to regularly or you maybe listen to occasionally? You have to come back to that one?
Maybe the Miracles album City of Angels. It came out in the late 1970s. It's a great musical album and it's very iconic for that era. But apart from the very different musical styles within it, there's one track which I think is really pioneering, and it's called Ain't Nobody Straight in LA. Ain't Nobody Straight in Los Angeles. And for a mainstream group, straight group, to put out that track in the late 1970s was really brave and pioneering. And I love, Yes, My Name is Michael. There's loads of tracks that I absolutely adore and still listen to today.
What would you say is your greatest achievement to date?
I think I'll let other people be the judge of that.
And then finally, the last one, Peter Tatchell, how do you wish to be remembered?
Again, I think it's probably best if other people, made that sort of decision or that conclusion. But I would say, I tried my best. I followed my conscience and did what I believed to be right. I may have been wrong sometimes, but I did what I believed to be right.
Peter Tatchell, thank you very kindly for giving up your time and being a guest on Your Take. It's been particularly hard to cover your life and everything you've done in 60 minutes because incredibly, you've been so committed, passionate about the things you do. And, I've been inspired to listen and, hear about your life story. For me, it's been a really interesting 60 minutes. And thank you for sharing your life, the difficulties you experienced in the early years and what you've achieved, over the course of your life and what other things you'll continue to go on to. I kind of just wanted to kind of finish up by, if you could just tell the viewers and listeners where they can go to find out more about your work and so forth, and also where they can see the documentary film.
So the documentary is called Hating Peter Tatchell. It's streaming now on Netflix and will be there for probably another year or more. If you want to find out more about my campaigns, please go to my foundation's website, which is petertatchellfoundation.org. There you'll see a resume of our campaigns, latest news releases and photos and other things. In the top right-hand corner, there's a button which says Join Us. If you click on that and give us your email address, it's totally free, there's no charge. We will send you a weekly bulletin on a range of human rights issues, LGBT and other human rights issues. Most of them are very serious, but we always, every week, try to include a quirky, funny one. I think you'll probably enjoy it. And if you don't like it, you can always unsubscribe. As I said, there's no charge. Next to the Join Us button is another button which says Donate. And if you feel willing and able to, we'd love to receive a donation to enable us to carry on our work. We don't get any organizational, institutional, or charitable funding apart from what donors, well-wishers give us. So we depend entirely on your donations to sustain the work. And if you can afford maybe £5 a month or something, that really does help sustain us and keep us going. And I think we're very good value for money. We have a huge reach here in the UK and around the world, even though there's only 2.5 of us. So your money will be well spent. But I just want to reiterate in conclusion, I have done my bit, but so have many others. And many of these others are unknown and unsung, but without them, we wouldn't have won the changes. The battle for LGBT plus rights, it wasn't won by me or Stonewall or Outrage. It was won by all the tens of thousands of LGBT plus people around the country who mobilized to support the campaign for law reform and social change. And of course, very, very importantly, our much valued straight friends and allies. It's we together who made those changes. And this is what I say to everyone. If you've got a cause to fight, if there's an issue you're passionate about, organize with others. Do your bit by yourself by all means, but try and get together with others, because together we are stronger, we're more effective. And so I'll just sign off with my motto, which I hope will inspire and motivate you. And it's very, very simple. Don't accept the world as it is. Dream of what the world could be, and then help make it happen. Thank you so much for a great interview. My best wishes to all your listeners and viewers.
Thank you kindly. I think a beautiful note to end on, hugely inspiring. And I wish you all the very best for the future, and also a happy Christmas and all the very best for 2022.
Thank you.